It was a bright and sunny Saturday morning in Oakwood Hills. The birds were chirping, the sky was blue, and Jake Miller was outside doing something super normal. He was watering his lawn. You know, just regular stuff that people do to keep their grass nice and green. Jake turned on his sprinkler, and little drops of water sprayed all over his small front yard. He wasn't bothering anyone. He was just minding his own business, like he always did. Jake was that kind of guy, quiet, friendly, and easy to like. But here's the thing, nobody really noticed him. He wasn't loud or flashy. He didn't have a big fancy house or a shiny new car. Nope, Jake lived in a little house with chipped paint, and he drove an old, beat-up truck that rattled when it started. To most people, he was just there. Nothing special, nothing exciting. But Jake didn't mind. He liked his simple life. Now, let's talk about the other side of the street. That's where Linda lived. Oh boy, Linda was totally different from Jake. She wasn't quiet or easygoing. Nope, Linda was loud, bossy, and always in everybody's business. She was the queen of the HOA. That's the group that makes rules for the neighborhood, like when you can water your grass or what color your mailbox can be. Linda loved those rules. She loved them so much that she carried around a little book with all the HOA rules written in it. She'd wave it in people's faces if they did something she didn't like. And trust me, she didn't like a lot of things. If your trash can was out too long, Linda would knock on your door. If your dog barked one time too many, Linda would write you a nasty note. People in Oakwood Hills had a nickname for her. They called her HOA Karen. They didn't say it to her face, of course, because nobody wanted to deal with her yelling. But behind her back. Oh yeah, everybody whispered it. And let me tell you, she earned that name every single day. So, there was Jake, standing on his lawn, watching the water sprinkle out of his little machine. It was a hot day, and the grass looked thirsty. He figured it was a good time to give it a drink. The sprinkler made a soft whoosh whoosh sound as it turned back and forth. The water sparkled in the sunlight, making tiny rainbows in the air. Jake smiled a little. He liked how peaceful it felt. He wasn't trying to cause trouble. He wasn't trying to make anyone mad. He just wanted his yard to look nice. That's it. Simple, right? But then, across the street, Linda's front door flew open. Bam! It slammed against the wall so hard you could hear it from Jake's house. Out she came, stomping down her porch steps like she was on a mission. Her flip-flops slapped against her feet, slap, 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 and her face was red, like she'd just bitten into a sour lemon. She had her HOA rulebook in one hand and her phone in the other. Oh no, Jake thought. Here we go again. Linda stopped at the edge of her yard, right where her perfect green grass met the sidewalk. She stared at Jake and his sprinkler like it was the worst thing she'd ever seen. Her eyes got all squinty, and her mouth turned into a tight little line. She looked mad. Really, really mad. Hey, you, she shouted, pointing at Jake like he'd just robbed a bank. What do you think you're doing? Her voice was loud and screechy, like a car horn that wouldn't stop. Jake looked up from his sprinkler. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, one hand in his pocket, the other holding the hose. He was calm, like always. I'm watering my lawn, he said, nice and simple. His voice was quiet, not yelling back. He didn't sound mad or scared. Just normal. But Linda? Oh, she wasn't having it. You can't water your lawn today, she yelled. It's Saturday. The rules say no watering on Saturdays. Don't you know anything? She waved her rulebook in the air, shaking it like it was proof she was right. Jake tilted his head a little, like he was thinking about it. I checked the schedule, he said. It's fine today. That was true. Jake was careful. He always followed the rules, even the silly ones. He didn't want trouble. But Linda didn't care about that. She didn't even listen to him. She just kept going. No, 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 she snapped. You're wrong. You're breaking the rules, and I'm not going to let you get away with it. Jake scratched his head. He didn't get why she was so upset. It was just water. It was just grass. Nobody was getting hurt. But Linda acted like he'd set her house on fire or something crazy like that. She took a big step forward, crossing the street toward him. Her flip-flops kept slapping the pavement, slap, 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 and she didn't stop yelling. "I've had enough of you," she said. "You with your noisy truck and your messy yard, and now this sprinkler nonsense. I'm calling the cops. You're done." She held up her phone and started tapping the screen, like she couldn't wait to tattle on him. Now, here's where things get interesting. Jake didn't argue. He didn't yell back. He didn't even look worried. Most people would freak out if someone threatened to call the police over something as small as a sprinkler. But not Jake. He just shrugged his shoulders, turned off the sprinkler, and leaned against his old truck. The water stopped spraying, and the yard got quiet again. Linda kept talking, telling the 911 operator all about the crime happening on her street. "Yes, hello," she said into the phone. "There's a man here breaking the rules with his sprinkler. You need to send someone right now." She sounded so proud of herself, like she was saving the world from Jake and his water. But Jake? He just stood there, watching her. His arms were crossed, and his face was calm. Too calm, maybe. If you looked close, you might have seen a tiny little smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't a big grin or anything, just a small, sneaky smirk. Like he knew something Linda didn't. Like he wasn't scared of her at all. Why wasn't he worried? What was going on in his head? Most people would be mad or nervous if a crazy neighbor called the cops on them. But Jake acted like it was no big deal. Like he had a secret up his sleeve. And guess what? He did. A big one. But Linda had no clue. She was too busy yelling and stomping around to notice anything strange. "Here's a question for you," I say, leaning in close like I'm telling you a secret. "What would you do if someone flipped out over something as little as a sprinkler? Would you argue? Would you laugh? Would you just wait and see what happens?" Stick around, because Linda's about to lose it and she has no idea what's coming her way. This story's just getting started, and trust me, you won't believe what happens next. Let's pause for a second and picture this. Oakwood Hills was a quiet little neighborhood. The houses weren't huge, but they were neat, with flowers in the yards and kids riding bikes down the street. It was the kind of place where people waved hello and shared cookies at Christmas. But Linda? She didn't fit that vibe. She was like a storm cloud on a sunny day, always ready to rain on someone's parade. Jake, though. He was the opposite. He was like the sunshine, steady, warm, and not bothering anybody. Nobody thought much about him. He didn't stand out. He didn't cause drama. He just lived his life, day after day, in his little house with his old truck. But Linda couldn't stand him. She'd been picking on him ever since he moved in 6 months ago. First, it was his truck. "It's too loud," she'd complained, even though it barely made a sound. Then it was his trash cans. "They're too close to the curb," she'd said, measuring them with a ruler one day. And once, when Jake's dog barked at a squirrel, Linda left a note on his door that said, "Control your animal or else." Jake never fought back. He'd just nod, say okay, and go about his day. That drove Linda nuts. She wanted him to argue. She wanted a big fight so she could win and feel important. But Jake wouldn't give her that. He stayed quiet, and that made her even madder. So now, here they were, Jake with his sprinkler, Linda with her phone, and a big showdown brewing on this sunny Saturday morning. The neighbors started peeking out their windows. Mrs. Carter next door lifted her curtain just a little. Mr. Lopez down the street stopped mowing his lawn to watch. Everybody knew Linda loved drama, and they figured this was just another one of her silly fights. They didn't think it would turn into anything big. They thought Jake would back down, like always, and Linda would strut back to her house, happy she'd won again. But oh, they were so wrong. This wasn't going to be like the other times. This was going to be different. Way different. Jake's truck was parked right there in his driveway. It was old and rusty, with a dent on the side from when he'd backed into a pole last year. Linda hated that truck. She said it made the neighborhood look trashy. But Jake liked it. It got him to work and back, and that's all he cared about. He leaned against it now, the metal warm from the sun. His hands were in his pockets, and he watched Linda like she was putting on a show. She was still on the phone, talking fast. "Yes, officer, he's breaking the rules right now. I need someone here quick," she said. She kept glancing at Jake, waiting for him to get mad or scared. But he didn't. He just stood there, cool as a cucumber. The sprinkler sat in the grass, quiet now. Little drops of water still clung to the blades, shining like tiny jewels. Jake's yard wasn't perfect, it had some brown spots and a few weeds, but he tried his best. He wasn't rich. He didn't have a big sprinkler system like Linda did. He just had this one little machine he'd bought at the store for $10. It did the job, and that's what mattered to him. But to Linda, it was like a crime scene. She couldn't stand that he was using it. She couldn't stand that he wasn't following her rules. She wanted everything perfect, and Jake? He wasn't perfect enough for her. The air felt warm and sticky. Summer was in full swing, and the sun climbed higher in the sky. A few kids rode by on their bikes, slowing down to see what was happening. "What's she yelling about now?" one of them whispered. "Probably something dumb," another kid said. They giggled and pedaled off. The grown-ups, though. They stayed quiet, watching from their houses. Nobody liked Linda much, but nobody wanted to get on her bad side either. She had a way of making life hard if you crossed her. So they just watched, waiting to see how this would play out. Jake's house was small, with white walls that needed a new coat of paint. The windows were old, and one had a crack in the corner from a storm last year. But it was his home, and he liked it. He'd moved to Oakwood Hills because it was quiet, or at least, it was supposed to be. Linda made sure it wasn't. She was always finding something to complain about. If it wasn't Jake, it was someone else. She'd once yelled at Mrs. Carter for planting flowers that were too bright. She'd told Mr. Lopez his mower was too noisy. Nobody was safe from her. But Jake? He got it the worst. Maybe because he was new. Maybe because he didn't fight back. Or maybe because Linda just didn't like him. And now, here she was, calling the cops over a sprinkler. It sounded silly, right? Who calls 911 over something like that? But Linda did. She loved being in charge, and she loved making people feel small. She thought she was the boss of Oakwood Hills, and she wanted everyone to know it. Jake, though. He didn't care about being the boss. He didn't care about winning fights or looking important. He just wanted to live his life. But today, something was different. Today, Linda was about to find out she'd picked the wrong guy to mess with. That little smirk on Jake's face? It was still there, hiding in the corner of his mouth. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. He just waited, leaning against his truck, while Linda ranted and raved. She thought she had him cornered. She thought she was going to win, like always. But she didn't know the whole story. She didn't know who Jake really was. And that's what makes this so good. Because in just a little while, everything was going to flip upside down and Linda wasn't going to see it coming. "Here's one more question for you," I say, grinning. "What do you think Jake's hiding? Why isn't he scared? Stick with me, because this sunny Saturday morning is about to turn into the wildest day Oakwood Hills has ever seen. You won't want to miss what happens next." It was a nice, sunny morning in Oakwood Hills, and Jake Miller was doing his usual thing. He flipped on his sprinkler, just like he did most days when his grass looked dry. The little sprinkler wasn't fancy or big, it was one of those cheap ones you get at the store. But it worked fine. Tiny jets of water shot out, sparkling in the bright sunlight like little diamonds. The water landed on his patchy lawn, soaking the brown spots and the green spots too. Jake's yard wasn't perfect. It had some weeds poking up here and there, and the grass didn't grow all nice and even like some people's did. But Jake didn't mind. He liked his little house and his little yard just the way they were. He stood there for a second, watching the water spray back and forth. It made a soft whoosh whoosh sound, kind of relaxing. Everything was calm. Everything was normal. At least, it was for about 5 minutes. Then, all of a sudden, trouble came stomping out from across the street. That trouble's name was Linda. She was Jake's neighbor, and oh boy, she was not happy. Linda didn't just walk out of her house, she stormed out. Her front door flew open with a loud bang, and she came charging down her porch steps like a tornado wearing flip-flops. Those flip-flops went slap, slap, slap against her feet as she marched across her perfect lawn. Her face was all scrunched up and red, like she'd just sniffed something stinky. In one hand, she held her HOA rule book, gripping it tight like it was her favorite toy. In the other hand, she waved her phone around like she was about to throw it at someone. She stopped right at the edge of her yard, where her grass met the sidewalk, and she stared at Jake. Her eyes were narrow, and her mouth was a tight little line. She looked mad. Really, really mad. You're watering on the wrong day. Linda yelled. Her voice was loud and sharp, like a teacher scolding a kid who forgot their homework. She pointed at Jake with one finger, like he'd done something terrible. It's Saturday. You can't water on Saturday. It's against the rules. She shook her rule book in the air, holding it up high so everyone could see it. That book was her weapon. She loved it more than anything. It had all the HOA rules written inside, and Linda knew every single one by heart. She was the boss of the neighborhood, or at least she thought she was. And right now, she was ready to fight Jake over his sprinkler. Jake didn't say much. He just shrugged his shoulders, nice and easy. He wasn't yelling back or getting upset. He stayed calm, like he always did. I checked the rules, he said in his quiet voice. It's okay to water today. And he was right. He'd looked at the HOA schedule the day before, just to be sure. Jake wasn't the kind of guy who broke rules on purpose. He liked keeping things simple and staying out of trouble. But Linda? She didn't care if he was right or wrong. She didn't even listen to him. She just kept shouting. No, you're wrong, she snapped. It's against the rules, and I'm calling the cops. Her voice got louder with every word, and she started tapping on her phone, like she couldn't wait to tell someone about Jake's crime. Now, this wasn't the first time Linda had gotten mad at Jake. Oh no, she'd been picking on him ever since he moved into Oakwood Hills 6 months ago. She'd called him out for all kinds of little things. Once, it was about his truck. Jake had an old, beat-up truck that rattled a little when he started it. Linda said it was too loud and told him to get rid of it. It's ruining the neighborhood, she'd complained. Jake didn't argue. He just nodded and kept driving it anyway. Another time, it was his trash cans. He'd put them out by the curb the night before pickup, like everybody else. But Linda marched over with a ruler and measured how close they were to the street. Too close, she'd yelled. They're supposed to be 3 feet back. Jake moved them, but he didn't say much. And then there was the time his dog barked. Just one bark, at midnight, because a squirrel ran by. Linda left a note on his door the next day that said, "Keep your dog quiet, or I'll report you." Jake's dog was a little black mutt named Buddy, and Buddy was super quiet most of the time. But Linda didn't care. She found something to complain about no matter what Jake did. So, this sprinkler fight? It was just another day for Linda. She loved getting mad. She loved being in charge. And she loved making people feel small. Jake, though. He'd heard her threats before. I'm calling the cops, she'd say, and most of the time, nothing happened. She'd yell, she'd wave her rulebook, and then she'd go back inside, happy she'd made a fuss. Jake was used to it by now. He didn't get worked up about it. He didn't shout or fight back. He just let her talk and did his own thing. But today, something felt a little different. Linda was extra loud, extra angry. And Jake? He was extra calm. Way too calm. See, here's the thing Linda didn't know, Jake wasn't just some quiet guy who lived across the street. He wasn't just a regular dude with a small house and an old truck. Nope, Jake had a secret. A big one. And while Linda was screaming her head off, waving that rulebook like a flag, Jake stood there like nothing was wrong. His hands were in his pockets, and he leaned against his truck, watching her. Most people would be nervous if someone threatened to call the police over a sprinkler. Most people would say something back, like "leave me alone," or "you're crazy." But not Jake. He didn't look scared. He didn't look mad. He just looked chill. Too chill, maybe. Like he knew something Linda didn't. Like he wasn't worried at all about her big threats. Linda kept going. "You think you can just ignore the rules," she shouted. "I'm the HOA president, and I say what goes around here. You're breaking the law, and I'm not letting you get away with it." She held up her phone and started dialing. "Hello, yes, 911, she said, loud enough for the whole street to hear. "I've got a man here breaking the HOA rules with his sprinkler. You need to send someone right now." She sounded so proud of herself, like she was catching a bank robber or something. She kept glaring at Jake, waiting for him to panic. She wanted him to beg her to stop or run inside and hide. That's what she loved, making people squirm. But Jake didn't squirm. He didn't move. He just stood there, arms crossed, looking at her like she was putting on a funny show. The sprinkler was still sitting in the grass, quiet now. Jake had turned it off when Linda started yelling. The little jets of water had stopped, but the lawn was still wet, with tiny drops shining in the sun. Jake's yard wasn't much to look at. It wasn't all green and perfect like Linda's. Her lawn was like a picture from a magazine: no weeds, no brown spots, just smooth, bright grass. She paid a guy to mow it every week and water it just right. Jake didn't have that kind of money. He did his yard himself, with his $10 sprinkler and a rusty old mower. But he didn't care if it wasn't perfect. He wasn't trying to win any prizes. He just wanted a nice place to sit outside sometimes. Linda's house, though. It was the opposite. Her little white house had flower boxes under every window, full of red and pink blooms. Her porch had a fancy swing with cushions, and her mailbox was painted to match her shutters. Everything about her place screamed, "I'm better than you." She worked hard to make it look that way. And she worked even harder to make sure everyone followed her rules. That's why Jake's sprinkler made her so mad. To her, it wasn't just water, it was a big sign that Jake wasn't listening to her. And Linda couldn't stand that. She needed to be the boss, always. The neighbors started noticing the commotion. Mrs. Carter, who lived next to Jake, peeked out her window. She pulled her curtain back just a little, trying not to get caught watching. Mr. Lopez, who lived a few houses down, stopped sweeping his driveway and leaned on his broom. They'd seen Linda yell before. They knew she loved a good fight. But this time, it was over a sprinkler? That seemed extra silly, even for her. What's she mad about now? Mrs. Carter muttered to herself. Probably something dumb, Mr. Lopez thought. They didn't say it out loud, though. Nobody wanted to get on Linda's bad side. She had a way of making trouble if you crossed her. Jake's truck was parked right there in his driveway. It was old and scratched up, with a big dent on the side. Linda hated that truck. She said it looked trashy and told Jake to park it somewhere else. But Jake didn't have a garage, so where was he supposed to put it? He liked his truck just fine. It got him around, and that's what mattered. Right now, he leaned against it, the metal warm from the sun. He watched Linda like she was a loud bird squawking in a tree. She kept talking on the phone, telling the 911 operator all about Jake's sprinkler. "Yes, he's breaking the rules right now," she said. "I need someone here quick." She sounded so serious, like it was a real emergency. If you didn't know better, you'd think Jake was doing something dangerous, not just watering his grass. But Jake didn't budge. He didn't yell back or try to stop her. He just stood there, calm as could be. His hands stayed in his pockets, and his eyes followed Linda as she paced back and forth. She was still in her flip-flops, and they kept slapping the ground, slap, slap, slap. Her voice got louder and louder, echoing down the street. "This is ridiculous," she shouted. "People like him think they can do whatever they want. Well, not on my watch." She pointed at Jake again, like he was some big bad guy. But Jake didn't look like a bad guy. He looked like a regular dude in a t-shirt and jeans, standing by his truck on a sunny day. Here's where it gets good, though. Linda thought she had Jake all figured out. She thought he was just some quiet nobody who didn't matter. She thought she could boss him around, scare him with her rules, and win this little fight. But she didn't know the truth. She didn't know Jake had something up his sleeve, something big. While she was screaming and waving her rule book, Jake stayed quiet. Too quiet. Most people would be sweating or arguing by now. Most people would hate having the cops called on them over something so small. But Jake? He didn't blink. He didn't frown. He just waited, like he wasn't scared at all. Like he had a trick she couldn't see yet. The sun kept shining, and the air got hotter. A few kids rode by on their bikes, slowing down to watch Linda yell. "What's she doing?" one kid asked. "Being crazy again," another said. They laughed and pedaled off, their voices fading down the street. The grown UPS stayed quiet, though. They watched from their windows and porches, wondering what would happen next. They figured Jake would give up, like he always did. They thought Linda would win, like she always did. But they didn't know what we know. They didn't know Jake wasn't worried for a reason. They didn't know he had a secret that was about to change everything. Linda hung up the phone and crossed her arms. "The cops are coming," she said, smirking at Jake. "You're in big trouble now." She stood there, looking so proud, like she'd just won a prize. She thought she'd scared him. She thought she'd beat him. But Jake? He didn't say a word. He just looked at her, his face still calm. And if you looked close, really close, you might have seen that tiny smirk on his lips. It wasn't big, just a little twitch at the corner of his mouth. But it was there. And it meant something. It meant Linda didn't have a clue what was coming. It meant Jake wasn't just some guy with a sprinkler. It meant this fight wasn't over, not even close. What was Jake hiding? Why wasn't he scared? You'll see, Linda was on a mission. She didn't waste a single second. As soon as she decided Jake's sprinkler was breaking her precious HOA rules, she grabbed her phone and dialed 911. She didn't even step off her porch, she just stood there, right in front of her perfect little house, and started yelling into the phone. "Hello, yes, 911, she screeched, her voice so loud it bounced off the houses across the street. "There's a man breaking the law with his sprinkler. Right now, on my street." She sounded like she'd caught someone stealing candy from a baby, not just watering some grass. Her flip-flop slapped against the porch as she stomped back and forth, waving her free hand like she was trying to swat a fly. She wanted everyone to hear her. She wanted everyone to know she was in charge. The neighbors couldn't help but notice. All down Oakwood Hills, curtains twitched, and heads poked out from behind blinds. Mrs. Carter, who lived next to Jake, peeked through her kitchen window, her eyes wide. Mr. Lopez, a few houses down, stopped sweeping his driveway and leaned on his broom, shaking his head. They'd seen Linda get mad before lots of times, actually. She was always yelling about something silly, like trash cans or noisy dogs. But calling the cops over a sprinkler? That was a new one, even for her. "She's at it again," Mrs. Carter muttered to herself, pulling her curtain back just a little more. "What a nut," Mr. Lopez thought, rolling his eyes. They didn't say it out loud, though. Nobody wanted Linda to turn her anger on them next. Jake, meanwhile, didn't seem to care at all. He just stood there by his old, rusty truck, watching Linda like she was a loud bird making a fuss. When she started yelling into the phone, he reached down and turned off his sprinkler. The little jets of water stopped spraying, and the whoosh whoosh sound went quiet. The grass was still wet, with tiny drops shining in the sun, but the sprinkler sat there, doing nothing now. Jake didn't say a word. He didn't argue or shout back. He just leaned against his truck, his arms crossed over his chest, and waited. His face was calm, like he wasn't worried one bit. But here's the funny thing, if you looked really close, you'd see something. A tiny smirk crept onto his face. It wasn't a big smile or a laugh. It was just a little twitch at the corner of his mouth, small enough that you might miss it if you weren't paying attention. But it was there. And it made you wonder, what was Jake thinking? Why wasn't he scared? Linda didn't notice that smirk. She was too busy pacing on her porch, her flip-flops going slap, slap, slap with every step. She kept talking on the phone, her voice getting louder and louder. "Yes, he's breaking the HOA rules," she told the 911 operator. "He's watering his lawn on the wrong day, and I've told him a million times to stop. You need to send someone quick." She sounded so proud, like she was a superhero catching a bad guy. She smirked too, but her smirk was big and mean, not small and sneaky like Jake's. She looked over at him, her eyes narrow, and nodded to herself. In her mind, she'd already won. She thought the cops would come, yell at Jake, and make him sorry for daring to use his sprinkler. She thought she was the queen of Oakwood Hills, and Jake was just a nobody who'd learn his lesson. Minutes ticked by. The sun climbed higher in the sky, making the air hot and sticky. Jake stayed where he was, leaning against his truck. His t-shirt was plain blue, and his jeans were a little faded, but he looked comfortable, like he was just hanging out on a normal day. His truck was old, with scratches and a big dent on the side. Linda hated that truck. She said it made the neighborhood look trashy. But Jake didn't care. He liked it just fine. It got him where he needed to go, and that was enough. Right now, the truck felt warm against his back from sitting in the sun all morning. He shifted a little, but he didn't move away. He just kept watching Linda, that tiny smirk still hiding on his face. Linda hung up the phone and crossed her arms. "They're on their way," she called out to Jake, her voice full of sass. "You're in big trouble now, mister." She stood tall on her porch, like she'd just won a prize at the fair. Her flip-flops were bright pink, and her hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail that bounced when she moved. She looked so sure of herself, like nothing could stop her. She pointed at Jake again, just to make sure he knew she was talking to him. "You can't just do whatever you want around here," she said. "I'm the HOA president, and I make the rules. You'll see." She smirked even bigger, thinking she had Jake right where she wanted him. The street was quiet for a minute. The kids who'd been riding their bikes earlier were gone now, off playing somewhere else. The neighbors stayed at their windows, watching like it was a show on TV. Mrs. Carter's cat jumped up on the windowsill, peeking out too, its tail flicking back and forth. Mr. Lopez wiped sweat off his forehead and kept leaning on his broom, waiting to see what would happen. They all figured the cops wouldn't care much about a sprinkler. It was a silly thing to call about, after all. But they knew Linda, she'd make a big deal out of anything if it meant she got to be the boss. So they watched, curious but not too surprised. Jake didn't say anything back to Linda. He didn't need to. He just stood there, his arms still crossed, his eyes on her. That tiny smirk stayed on his face, like he was holding in a secret laugh. Most people would be mad by now. Most people would yell back or try to explain why they weren't wrong. But not Jake. He didn't look mad or scared or even annoyed. He looked fine. Too fine, maybe. Like he wasn't worried about the cops at all. Like he knew something Linda didn't. And that's because he did. He had a secret, a big one, and it was about to make this day a whole lot crazier. More minutes passed. The sun kept shining, and a little breeze blew through, rustling the leaves on the trees. Jake's sprinkler sat in the grass, quiet and still. His lawn looked a little greener where the water had soaked in, but it still had those patchy brown spots. Linda's lawn, though. It was perfect. Bright green, no weeds, cut just right. She paid a guy to take care of it, and she bragged about it all the time. "My yard's the best on the street," she'd say whenever she got the chance. Jake's yard wasn't the best, but he didn't care. He wasn't trying to win a contest. He just wanted his grass to stay alive, and that's why he turned on the sprinkler in the first place. Linda kept pacing. She couldn't stand still. Her flip-flop slapped the porch over and over, slap, 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 and she muttered to herself, loud enough for Jake to hear. "Thinks he's so smart," she grumbled. "Thinks he can ignore me. Well, he's wrong. The cops will fix him." She smirked again, glancing at Jake like he was a bug she was about to squash. She thought she had this all figured out. She thought the police would pull up, see her pointing at Jake, and take her side right away. She thought she'd win, just like she always did when she complained about something. But oh, she was in for a surprise. Then, something weird happened. A police car rolled up. It came fast, turning onto the street with its lights flashing red and blue. There was no siren, though, just the quiet hum of the engine as it got closer. The car stopped right in front of Linda's house, its tires crunching on the gravel at the edge of the road. Jake straightened up a little, but he didn't move from his truck. Linda stopped pacing. She put her hands on her hips and stood tall, like a general ready to lead an army. Her smirk got even bigger, and her eyes lit up. "Here they are," she said, loud and proud. "Told you, Jake. You're done now." She pointed at him with one finger, ready to tell the cops all about his terrible sprinkler crime. The police car's doors opened, and two officers stepped out. They were big guys, wearing dark blue uniforms with shiny badges on their chests. One had a clipboard in his hand, and the other had a serious look on his face. Linda waved at them, like she was greeting old friends. "Over here," she called. "He's the one breaking the rules." She pointed at Jake again, her finger shaking a little because she was so excited. She thought this was it, the moment she'd win. She thought the cops would march right over to Jake, Tell him off, and maybe even give him a ticket. She couldn't wait to see his face when they did. She couldn't wait to brag to the neighbors about how she'd saved the day. But then, something really strange happened. The cops didn't look at Jake. Not even a little. They didn't walk toward his house or his truck or his sprinkler. Nope. They turned the other way. They headed straight for Linda's house. Their boots crunched on her perfect gravel walkway as they climbed the steps to her porch. Linda's smirk froze on her face. Her eyes got wide, and her mouth opened a little, like she wasn't sure what was going on. "Wait, what?" she said, her voice quieter now. No, he's over there." She pointed at Jake again, but the cops didn't turn around. They stopped right in front of her, looking at her like she was the one they'd come to see. Jake watched it all happen. That tiny smirk on his face got just a little bigger, not a lot, just enough to notice if you were looking close. He didn't say anything. He didn't move. He just stood there by his truck, his arms still crossed, his eyes on Linda and the cops. The neighbors noticed too. Mrs. Carter's curtain dropped. She was too shocked to keep holding it. Mr. Lopez's broom slipped out of his hand and clattered to the ground. "What's happening?" Mrs. Carter whispered to her cat. "This ain't right," Mr. Lopez muttered, scratching his head. They'd thought the cops were here for Jake. That's what Linda had said, right? But now, the cops were at her door. What was going on? Linda blinked at the officers, her hands still on her hips. "You've got the wrong house," she said, her voice getting loud again. "I called you about him." She jabbed her finger toward Jake one more time, like that would fix everything. But the cop with the clipboard shook his head. "Ma'am," he said, his voice deep and calm, "we need to talk to you." He held up the clipboard, like it had something important written on it. The other cop stepped closer, his face still serious. Linda's smirk was gone now. Her mouth opened and closed, like a fish out of water, but no words came out. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know what was happening. Jake's smirk stayed right where it was. He didn't laugh or cheer or say "I told you so." He just watched, quiet as ever. But that little smile meant something. It meant he wasn't surprised. It meant he'd been waiting for this. It meant he knew something Linda didn't, and now, the cops were here to prove it. The neighbors leaned closer to their windows, holding their breath. The street was so quiet you could hear the leaves rustling in the breeze. What was going on? Why were the cops at Linda's house? What did Jake know that nobody else did? Hang tight, this is about to get good. Linda thought she was the winner, but the game was changing fast. Jake's secret was starting to peek out, and it was going to turn this sunny day upside down. Stick around, because you won't believe what happens next. Soon enough. This sunny morning was about to turn into something wild, and Linda was in for the surprise of her life. Stick around, because the real fun's just starting. The police car was parked right in front of Linda's house, its red and blue lights flashing in the bright sunlight. The two officers stood on her porch, looking serious. One of them, a tall guy with short brown hair, knocked on her door. Knock, knock, knock loud enough that it echoed down the quiet street. Linda was still standing there, her hands on her hips, ready to tell them all about Jake and his sprinkler. She'd been so sure they were here for him. She'd been smirking just a minute ago, thinking she'd won this fight. But when the cop knocked, that smug look on her face started to slip. Her eyes got a little wider, and her mouth twitched, like she wasn't so sure anymore. "Ma'am, we need to speak with you," the cop with the clipboard said. His voice was deep and calm, like he was talking about the weather, not something big. He held up the clipboard in one hand, and with the other, he pulled a piece of paper out of his pocket. "We've got a warrant," he said, showing her the paper. "A warrant? That's a special note from a judge that says the cops can come inside your house to look for something bad." Linda's jaw dropped. Her mouth fell open so fast it looked like it hit the ground. Her face went funny. First it was all red from yelling, and now it was turning pale, like she'd seen a ghost. "For what?" she sputtered, her voice all shaky and loud. "What are you talking about? I didn't do anything. He's the one you want." She pointed at Jake again, her finger wobbling in the air. That's when Jake moved. He'd been standing by his old truck this whole time, leaning against it with his arms crossed. He hadn't said much, just watched Linda yell and pace and call the cops. But now, He stepped forward, slow and easy, like he was taking a walk in the park. His sneakers crunched on the gravel in his driveway, and he stopped right in the middle of his yard. He looked at Linda, then at the cops, then back at Linda. "Oh, didn't I mention," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. It wasn't yelling, but it carried across the street, clear as day. He sounded so casual, like he was telling her the time or asking about the weather. "I'm not just your neighbor, Linda," he said. "I'm an undercover cop. And we've been watching you for months." Boom. The street went silent. You could have heard a leaf fall, it was so quiet. Nobody moved. Nobody said a word. The neighbors who'd been peeking out their windows froze. Mrs. Carter's curtain slipped from her fingers and fell shut. Mr. Lopez's broom, which he'd picked up again, dropped back to the ground with a little clunk. Everyone's eyes were on Jake now. Linda's face? Oh, it was a mess. First, it turned bright red, like a tomato ready to burst. Then, it went white, like all the color drained out of her. Her mouth was still open, but no sound came out. She looked at Jake, then at the cops, then back at Jake, like her brain couldn't figure out what was happening. "What?" she finally squeaked, her voice tiny and high, like a mouse caught in a trap. Jake didn't stop there. He took another step forward, his hands in his pockets now, all calm and cool. "Yeah, Linda," he said, nodding a little. "I've been living here, watching you, keeping track of everything. That sprinkler? The truck? The trash cans? All that stuff you got mad about? I was just doing my job, blending in. But you've been busy with something else, haven't you?" He tilted his head, that tiny smirk still on his face. It wasn't mean or loud, it was just there, like he knew he'd surprised her big time. The cops nodded at Jake, like they were saying, "Yup, he's with us." The one with the clipboard turned to Linda. "Ma'am, we've got a warrant to search your house," he said again, holding up the paper so she could see it. "We've got reason to believe you've been breaking the law." Linda shook her head fast, her ponytail bouncing. "No, no, no," she said, her voice getting loud again. "This is a mistake. I'm the HOA president. I don't break laws. He's the one with the sprinkler." She pointed at Jake one more time, but it didn't matter. The cops weren't listening to her anymore. They pushed past her, opening her front door and stepping inside. The neighbors couldn't believe it. Mrs. Carter opened her window a crack, trying to hear better. Mr. Lopez stepped off his porch, his eyes big. A couple of kids on bikes rode back down the street, slowing down to watch. "What's going on?" one kid whispered. "I don't know," the other said, "but it's cool." They parked their bikes and stared, mouths open. Everyone was looking at Linda's house now, not Jake's. The cops were here for her, not him. How did that happen? What did Jake mean about watching her? What was she hiding? Here's the big twist: Linda's perfect whole life wasn't so perfect after all. She acted like she was the best person in Oakwood Hills. Her house was always clean, her yard was always green, and she loved telling everyone what to do. She'd walk around with her rule book, bossing people around, acting like she was better than everybody else. But it was all a cover. A big, fat lie. Turns out, Linda had been doing something sneaky, something really bad. She'd been running an illegal side hustle right out of her garage. What was it? She was selling fake designer bags. You know those fancy purses and wallets you see in stores, the ones that cost tons of money? Linda was making copies, cheap, fake ones, and selling them to people for cash. She told them they were real, but they weren't. That's against the law, and she'd been doing it for a long time. Jake. He wasn't just some quiet guy with a sprinkler. He was an undercover cop, sent to live in Oakwood Hills and keep an eye on Linda. His job was to pretend to be normal, to blend in, so she wouldn't suspect anything. That's why he had the old truck and the little house. That's why he didn't fight back when she yelled about his trash cans or his dog. He wasn't supposed to stand out. He was supposed to watch her, listen to her, and figure out what she was up to. And he did. For months, he'd been building a case against her. Every time she got mad about his sprinkler or his truck, he was taking notes in his head. Every time she bragged about her perfect life, he was putting the pieces together. He knew about the fake bags. He knew where she kept them. And now, the cops were here to prove it. Linda didn't know what to do. She stood on her porch, her flip-flops stuck to the wood like glue. "This isn't happening," she yelped, her hands flying up to her face. "You've got the wrong person. I'm not a criminal." But the cops didn't stop. They walked right into her house, their boots loud on her shiny floor. One of them went straight to the garage door and opened it. Inside, there were boxes, tons of them stacked up high. The cop with the clipboard pulled one down and ripped it open. Out came a purse, all shiny and pretty, with a big logo on it. "This look real to you?" he asked the other cop, holding it up. The second cop shook his head. "Nope. Fake," he said. They kept pulling out more bags, wallets, even a few belts, all fake, all part of Linda's secret business. The neighbors gasped. Mrs. Carter's cat jumped off the windowsill, surprised by her loud "oh my gosh." Mr. Lopez dropped his broom again, his mouth wide open. The kids on the bike started giggling, pointing at Linda's house. "She's in trouble," one of them said, laughing. Linda heard it all, and her face got redder than ever. "Stop that," she yelled at the cops, stomping her foot. "You can't do this. I'm innocent." But the cops didn't listen. They kept searching, pulling out more boxes, piling up the fake stuff on her porch. It was a mess. Her perfect life was falling apart right in front of everyone. Jake watched it all from his yard. He didn't cheer or laugh or say anything mean. He just stood there, his hands still in his pockets, that tiny smirk still on his face. He'd known this was coming. He'd planned it. Every time Linda yelled at him, every time she waved her rule book, he'd been waiting for this day. The sprinkler? That was just the last straw. She'd called the cops herself, thinking she'd get him in trouble, but she'd walked right into his trap. Who saw that coming? Not Linda, that's for sure. She thought she was so smart, so in charge. But Jake? He'd been smarter all along. The street wasn't silent anymore. Whispers started up, growing louder as the neighbors talked to each other. "He's a cop," Mrs. Carter said, sticking her head out her window. "An undercover cop," Mr. Lopez called back, shaking his head in disbelief. The kids on the bikes rode in circles, chanting, "Jake's a cop. Jake's a cop," like it was a game. Linda heard it all, and she looked like she wanted to disappear. Her hands were shaking now, and her eyes darted around, looking for a way out. But there was no way out. The cops were in her house, the fake bags were on her porch, and Jake was standing there, cool as ever, letting it all happen. Linda tried one more time. "This is a mistake," she shouted, her voice cracking. "He's lying. I didn't do anything." She pointed at Jake again, but it was no use. The cop with the clipboard turned to her, his face still calm. "Ma'am, we've got proof," he said. "We've been watching you too. Jake's been helping us. You're in trouble, not him." He held up the warrant again, like it was the final word. Linda's shoulders slumped. Her flip-flops stopped slapping. She looked small all of a sudden, not like the big, bossy HOA queen she'd been 5 minutes ago. Jake finally spoke again. "You should have left the sprinkler alone, Linda," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "I was just doing my job. You made this easy." He shrugged, like it was no big deal. But it was a big deal. The neighbors couldn't stop staring. The cops kept working, carrying more boxes out of the garage. Linda's perfect life was gone, and Jake's secret was out. He wasn't just a guy with a truck and a sprinkler. He was a hero, hiding right there in Oakwood Hills, waiting for the right moment to catch the real bad guy or bad lady, in this case. Who saw that coming? Nobody, that's who. Linda thought she was winning, but she'd lost everything. Jake had been quiet, patient, and smart, and now he was the one everyone was talking about. The street buzzed with noise now, gasps, whispers, and the sound of fake bags hitting the porch. Linda stood there, defeated, while Jake watched it all unfold. This was the big moment, the big reveal, and it was better than anyone could have guessed. The cops were busy now, moving fast on Linda's porch. The one with the clipboard kept writing stuff down, scribbling on his paper every time they found something new. The other cop pulled more boxes out of the garage, stacking them up high. Fake purses and wallets spilled out everywhere, shiny gold bags, black leather ones, even some with sparkly straps. They looked fancy at first, but up close, you could tell they weren't real. The logos were a little crooked, and the stitching was messy. Linda had been selling these to people, pretending they were the real deal, and making tons of money. But now, her secret was out, and it was all because of Jake. Linda couldn't move. She stood there, frozen, her pink flip-flops stuck to the porch like they were glued down. Her hands were up by her face, shaking a little, like she wanted to hide. "This can't be real," she kept saying, her voice all wobbly and loud. "You've got it all wrong. I'm not a bad guy." She looked at the cops, then at Jake, then at the growing pile of fake stuff. Her eyes were big and wild, darting around like she was looking for a way to run. But where could she go? The cops were right there, and the neighbors were watching from every window and porch on the street. She was trapped, and she knew it. Jake stayed where he was, standing in his yard with his hands in his pockets. His old truck was behind him, scratched and dented, but he didn't care about that now. He looked calm, like always too calm, maybe. That tiny smirk was still on his face, just a little curve at the corner of his mouth. He didn't laugh or cheer or jump around. He didn't need to. He'd done his job, and now everyone could see it. "You really didn't know, did you, Linda?" he said, his voice quiet but strong. "All those times you yelled at me, I was just waiting. Watching. You made it so easy." He shook his head a little, like he couldn't believe how things turned out. The neighbors were going crazy now. Mrs. Carter stuck her whole head out her window, not even trying to hide anymore. "Jake's a cop," she shouted, her voice high and squeaky. "An undercover cop." Mr. Lopez yelled back from his driveway, waving his broom in the air. "I knew he was too quiet," he said, laughing a little. The kids on their bikes rode closer, stopping at the edge of Jake's yard. "Cool," one of them said, his eyes big. "He's like a spy," the other kid added, grinning wide. They dropped their bikes in the grass and sat down, watching like it was the best movie ever. The whole street was buzzing, whispers, gasps, and little laughs popping up everywhere. Linda heard it all, and it made her madder. "Shut up," she snapped at the kids, her face turning red again. "This isn't funny. This is my house." She turned to the cops, stomping her foot so hard her flip-flop almost flew off. "You can't do this. I'm the HOA president. I'm important. He's the one who's wrong." She pointed at Jake again, her finger shaking more than ever. But the cops didn't even look at her when she said that. They were too busy pulling out more fake bags. One of them found a big box of wallets, brown ones, black ones, even a red one with a zipper. "More fakes," the cop muttered, tossing them onto the pile. The pile was getting so big it almost blocked Linda's front door. The cop with the clipboard turned to her. "Ma'am, stop talking," he said, not mean but firm. "We've got proof. Jake's been working with us. We know what you've been doing." He held up the warrant again, waving it in front of her face. "This says we can look, and we found what we needed. You're coming with us." Linda's mouth fell open again, but this time, no words came out. She just stared at the paper, then at the cop, then at Jake. Her hands dropped to her sides, and her shoulders slumped. She looked smaller now, not like the loud, bossy lady who'd been yelling 5 minutes ago. She looked lost. Jake watched her, his smirk fading a little. He didn't look happy or mean, just steady. "You thought I was just some guy," he said, loud enough for her to hear. "But I've been here for a reason. All those fights about my truck and my sprinkler? I let you yell because it kept you busy. Kept you from noticing me watching." He shrugged again, like it was no big deal. But it was a big deal. Jake wasn't just a neighbor. He was an undercover cop, and he'd been living right across the street, pretending to be normal, all so he could catch Linda. Every time she got mad, every time she waved her rule book, he'd been taking mental notes. Every time she bragged about her perfect yard or her fancy house, he'd been listening. He knew about the fake bags. He knew she kept them in her garage. And he knew today was the day it would all come crashing down. The cops kept working. They pulled out another box. This one had big purses with gold chains. "Fake," one cop said, shaking his head. They opened another, and out came some belts with shiny buckles. Fake, the other cop said. The pile kept growing, and Linda kept shrinking. She didn't yell anymore. She didn't point or stomp. She just stood there, staring at the mess on her porch. Her perfect life was gone. Her flowers still bloomed in their boxes, and her grass was still green, but none of that mattered now. Everyone knew her secret, and it wasn't pretty. The neighbors couldn't stop talking. Mrs. Carter called out to Mr. Lopez, "Did you know about this?" Mr. Lopez shook his head fast. "No way," he said. "I thought he was just quiet." Who knew he was a cop? The kids on the bikes started making up a song. Jake the cop, caught the bad guy on the block, they sang, giggling and riding in circles. A lady down the street, Mrs. Green, stepped onto her porch with a cup of coffee, her eyes big. "What's all this?" she asked, and Mr. Lopez shouted back, "Linda's a crook. Jake's a hero." The whole street was alive now, full of noise and excitement. Nobody could believe it. Quiet Jake, the guy with the old truck, was an undercover cop. And Linda, the HOA queen, was a sneaky lawbreaker. Linda tried one last thing. "I didn't know they were fake," she lied, her voice squeaky and desperate. "Someone gave them to me. I'm not a criminal." She looked at the cops, hoping they'd believe her. But the cop with the clipboard just sighed. "We've got proof, ma'am," he said. "People told us they bought from you. We've got pictures. Jake saw you selling them. It's over." He put the clipboard down and pulled out a pair of handcuffs. Linda's eyes got huge. "No," she yelped, stepping back. "You can't arrest me. I'm Linda. I'm the HOA president." But the cop didn't care. He stepped closer, and the other cop grabbed her arm, not hard, just enough to hold her still. Jake didn't move from his yard. He watched the cops put the handcuffs on Linda, her wrists clicking into the metal. She kept shaking her head, her ponytail bouncing like crazy. "This is wrong," she cried. "He tricked me. He's the bad guy." But nobody listened. The neighbors didn't believe her anymore. They'd seen the bags, heard Jake's words, and watched the cops. Linda wasn't the boss now, she was just a lady in trouble, caught in her own game. The cop with the clipboard nodded at Jake. "Good work," he said, giving him a little smile. "You got her." Jake nodded back, still calm. "Thanks," he said, simple and quiet. He didn't brag or act big. He didn't need to. The truth was out, and that was enough. The other cops started carrying the boxes to the police car, piling them in the back. There were so many they had to squish them to fit. Linda's porch looked empty now, except for her standing there in handcuffs, her flip-flops still on her feet. The kids on the bikes cheered. "Go, Jake," one of them yelled, pumping his fist. Mrs. Carter clapped her hands, her cat peeking out the window again. Mr. Lopez picked up his broom and waved it like a flag. "You're the man, Jake," he shouted. The whole street was on Jake's side now. They thought he was just some guy, quiet, boring, nothing special. But he wasn't. He was a hero, hiding right there in front of them, waiting for the perfect moment to show who he really was. Linda's face was a mess, red, white, sweaty, and scared. She didn't look like the HOA queen anymore. She looked like someone who'd lost everything. "I'll fight this," she mumbled, but it sounded weak, like she didn't believe it herself. The cops led her off the porch, down the steps, and toward the car. Her flip-flops dragged on the ground, slap, 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 slower now, like she didn't have the energy to lift her feet. The neighbors watched, some smiling, some shaking their heads. They'd put up with her yelling for years, and now she was done. Jake stayed in his yard, his hands still in his pockets. His sprinkler sat in the grass, quiet and wet from earlier. His truck was still parked, rusty and old, but it didn't matter. He didn't need a fancy car or a big house to be important. He'd caught Linda, and that's what counted. The cops opened the car door, and Linda got in, her head down. The door shut with a thunk, and the lights kept flashing red, blue, lighting up the street. The big reveal was over, but the street was still buzzing. Nobody could stop talking about it. "Jake's a cop," Mrs. Green said, sipping her coffee. "Who knew?" The kids kept singing their song, riding around in circles. Mrs. Carter went inside to tell her husband, and Mr. Lopez started sweeping again, grinning the whole time. Linda's perfect life was a lie, and Jake's secret was the truth. It was the wildest thing Oakwood Hills had ever seen, and it all started with a sprinkler. The cops had Linda now. They held her arms, one on each side, and walked her down the steps of her porch. Her hands were stuck together in shiny silver handcuffs, clicking every time she moved. Her pink flip-flops flapped against her feet, slap, slap, slap as she stumbled a little, trying to keep up. "This is a mistake," she yelled, her voice loud and squeaky. "You've got the wrong person. I didn't do anything." She twisted her head around, looking at the cops, then at Jake, then at the neighbors watching from their yards. But nobody said anything back. The cops didn't stop. They kept walking her toward their car, the lights still flashing red and blue in the bright sunshine. It wasn't a mistake, and Linda was starting to figure that out, even if she didn't want to admit it. Back at her house, the other cop was busy. He carried boxes out of her garage, one after another, stacking them up by the police car. Those boxes were full of evidence, stuff that proved Linda had been breaking the law. Inside were purses, wallets, and belts, all fake. They looked fancy, with big logos and shiny straps, but they weren't real. Linda had been selling them to people, telling them they were designer things that cost a lot of money. But they were just cheap knockoffs, and she'd been raking in cash for months, maybe even years. Now, the cops had it all. They opened one box and dumped it out. Purses fell onto the grass, black ones, red ones, even a sparkly gold one. "All fake," the cop muttered, shaking his head. He grabbed another box, this one with wallets, brown ones, blue ones, a pink one with a zipper. "Fake too," he said, tossing them into the pile. Jake watched it all from his lawn. He stood there, his arms crossed over his chest, his old truck parked behind him. That tiny smirk was still on his face, just a little curve at the corner of his mouth. He didn't cheer or jump around or say anything loud. He didn't need to. He'd done his job, and now everyone could see it. The cops were taking Linda away, and her sneaky business was over. Jake's grass was still wet from the sprinkler he'd turned off earlier, and little drops of water sparkled in the sun. He looked calm, like always, quiet and steady, like nothing could shake him. This was his moment, but he didn't act big or proud. He just watched, letting it all happen. The neighbors couldn't believe their eyes. Mrs. Carter, who lived next door, stepped out onto her porch, her cat trailing behind her. "Good job, Jake," she shouted, clapping her hands so loud it echoed down the street. Her gray hair bounced as she waved at him, a big smile on her face. Mr. Lopez, a few houses down, dropped his broom again and started clapping too. "You're the best, Jake," he yelled, his voice full of surprise and happiness. The kids on their bikes rode up close, stopping right in front of Jake's yard. "You're awesome," one kid said, pumping his fist in the air. "Yeah, you caught her," the other kid added, grinning wide. They'd been rolling their eyes at Jake before, thinking he was just some boring guy with a noisy truck. But now they were cheering for him, loud and proud. Jake didn't say much. He just waved at them, lifting one hand a little, like it was no big deal. "Thanks," he said, his voice quiet but friendly. He didn't want a big fuss. He didn't need everyone to make him feel special. He was humble, like always, just a guy who did what he had to do. But the neighbors kept going. Mrs. Green, the lady with the coffee, walked over from her house, her cup still in her hand. "I can't believe it," she said, shaking her head. "You're a hero, Jake." Another neighbor, Mr. Patel, poked his head out his window. "Way to go," he called, giving Jake a thumbs up. The whole street was alive with noise now, clapping, shouting, and happy chatter. They'd never seen anything like this in Oakwood Hills. The cops pushed Linda into the back of their car. She kept yelling, even as they opened the door. "This isn't fair," she cried, her flip-flops dragging on the ground. "I'm not a bad person. He tricked me." She pointed at Jake one last time, but the cops didn't care. They'd heard enough. The cop with the clipboard shut the door thunk and Linda's voice got quieter, muffled inside the car. You could still see her through the window, her face red and sweaty, her hands twisting in the handcuffs. She looked mad, scared, and confused all at once. but it didn't matter what she said now. The cops had the proof, and she was going with them. The other cop finished loading the boxes into the car. There were so many they had to squish them to fit. Purses and wallets poked out the back, some falling onto the ground as he slammed the trunk shut. "That's all of it," he said to his partner, wiping his hands on his pants. The cop with the clipboard nodded. "Let's go," he said, walking around to the driver's side. They climbed in, started the engine, and pulled away. The car rolled down the street, lights still flashing, with Linda in the back and all her fake stuff packed inside. The neighbors watched it go, some waving bye-bye, some just staring. Linda wasn't the HOA queen anymore. She was just a lady in trouble, caught by Jake and the cops. Jake turned back to his house, his arms still crossed. His sprinkler sat in the grass, quiet now, but he'd turn it on again later on the right day, of course. He wasn't worried about breaking rules. He'd always been careful, even when Linda didn't think so. His truck was still parked in the driveway, rusty and dented, but he didn't mind. It was his, and it worked just fine. He took a deep breath, looking around at the street. Things were going to be different now. Linda was gone, and everyone knew who he really was. But Jake didn't act like a big shot. He just nodded to himself, like he was happy it was over. By Monday, things had changed big time in Oakwood Hills. The HOA had a meeting that morning. Everyone got together in Mrs. Carter's living room because Linda's house wasn't an option anymore. They talked about what happened, and they picked a new president. Mrs. Green, the coffee lady, said she'd do it. "I won't yell at people," she promised, holding up her cup. "I just want the street to be nice." Everyone clapped for her, happy to have someone new. Linda wasn't there, of course. She was at the police station, facing jail time. The cops had told her she'd done some serious stuff. Selling fake things was against the law, and she might be locked up for a while. She didn't have her rulebook or her flip-flops now. She was just waiting to see what would happen next. Jake went back to his normal life, or as normal as it could be after all that. He turned his sprinkler on again that Monday, making sure it was the right day this time. The little jets of water sprayed out, soaking his patchy lawn. The whoosh-whoosh sound was back, soft and peaceful, like nothing had ever happened. His grass wasn't perfect, it still had brown spots and weeds, but it looked a little greener now. He stood there, watching it, his hands in his pockets. The sun was warm, and a breeze blew through, rustling the leaves. It was a quiet day, the kind Jake liked best. The neighbors didn't forget him, though. Mrs. Carter baked him some cookies, chocolate chip, his favorite, and left them on his porch with a note that said, "Thanks, Jake." Mr. Lopez stopped by with a big grin. "You're welcome at my barbecue anytime," he said, slapping Jake on the shoulder. The kids on their bikes rode by every day, waving and shouting, "Hi, Officer Jake." They thought he was the coolest guy ever now. Even Mrs. Green, the new HOA president, came over with her coffee. "You did a good thing," she told him, smiling. "We're lucky to have you." Jake just nodded and said, "Thanks," like always. He didn't want a big party or lots of praise. He was happy just being Jake. Linda's house sat empty that week. The flowers in her boxes started to droop, and her perfect lawn got a little shaggy without her guy to mow it. The neighbors didn't miss her yelling, though. They didn't miss her rulebook or her mean looks. They were glad she was gone, and they felt safe knowing Jake was around. He'd been watching out for them all along, even when they didn't know it. His little house still had chipped paint, and his truck still rattled, but that didn't matter. He wasn't just some guy anymore, he was their hero. Jake's sprinkler kept going, watering his lawn every few days. He checked the HOA schedule, just to be sure, and smiled a little when he saw Mrs. Green's new rules. They were simple: no yelling, no fighting, just keeping things nice. The street felt calmer now, happier. The kids rode their bikes, Mrs. Carter fed her cat, and Mr. Lopez swept his driveway, whistling a tune. Linda was facing jail, and justice was served. She'd thought she could trick everyone, but Jake had been smarter. He'd stayed quiet, waited, and won. The days went on, and Oakwood Hills settled down. Jake waved to the neighbors when he saw them, and they waved back, big smiles on their faces. His sprinkler stayed in the yard, his truck stayed in the driveway, and his life stayed simple. But everyone knew the truth now: he wasn't just a neighbor. He was the guy who fixed things, who made sure the bad stuff didn't win. Linda's flip-flops were gone, her fake bags were gone, and her bossy days were over. Jake had made sure of that, and the street was better for it. Reflective or inspiring closing. So, here's the thing, I say, slowing down my voice like I'm telling you a secret. Sometimes the person you think is just nobody is the one who changes everything. Think about it. Jake was just a guy with an old truck and a little sprinkler. He lived in a small house with chipped paint, and he didn't talk a lot. Linda looked at him and thought he was nothing special. She saw his rusty truck and his patchy lawn, and she judged him. She thought he was just some quiet dude who didn't matter. She yelled at him, bossed him around, and acted like she was the big boss of Oakwood Hills. But she was so wrong. She didn't see the truth coming, not even a little bit. Jake wasn't a nobody, he was a hero, hiding right there in front of her, waiting to do something big. I paused for a second, letting that sink in. Linda thought she knew everything. She thought her perfect house and her perfect yard made her better than Jake. She thought her rulebook and her loud voice gave her power. But Jake? He didn't need a fancy car or a loud mouth. He didn't need to show off or act big. He just stayed quiet, watched, and waited. And when the time was right, he changed it all. He caught her with her fake bags, and he showed everyone who she really was. That's pretty cool, right? The guy nobody noticed turned out to be the one who saved the day. Makes you wonder who's the real hero in your neighborhood. Let's think about that for a minute, I say, leaning in like we're best friends chatting. Maybe there's someone near you who seems boring or quiet. Maybe they don't have a shiny house or a loud laugh. Maybe you walk by them every day and don't even think about it. But what if they're like Jake? What if they're watching, waiting, ready to do something amazing? You never know who's hiding a big secret, just like he did. Linda didn't see it. She judged him by his truck and his sprinkler, but she missed the truth. And that truth was bigger than anything she could have guessed. I smile a little, picturing Jake in his yard. Jake didn't care what Linda thought. He didn't need her to like him or think he was cool. He just did his job, quiet and steady, until it was time to show who he really was. That's the thing about heroes, they don't always look like heroes. They don't wear capes or fly around. Sometimes they're just regular people, living regular lives, until something big happens. Jake was like that. He watered his lawn, drove his truck, and waved to the neighbors, all while keeping an eye on Linda. And when she messed up, he was ready. That's what makes the story so awesome. It's not just about catching a bad guy. It's about how the quiet ones can surprise you. So, here's a fun question, I say, my voice getting bright. Who's the quiet person in your life? Maybe it's a neighbor with an old bike, or a kid at school who doesn't talk much. Maybe it's someone you see all the time but don't really know. Could they be a hero, waiting for their moment? It's fun to think about, right? Jake was hiding in plain sight, and nobody saw it. Not Linda, not the neighbors, not even those kids on their bikes. But when the truth came out, wow, it changed everything. Linda's flip-flops stopped flapping, her fake bags got taken away, and Jake stood there, cool as ever. That's the kind of story that sticks with you. I lean back a little, winding down. Linda learned a big lesson that day. She thought she could judge people by how they looked or what they had. She thought Jake was small because he didn't fight back. But judging people like that? It's a bad idea. You never know who they really are inside. Jake didn't need to yell or brag, he just did what was right. And when it was over, the neighbors didn't roll their eyes at him anymore. They clapped and cheered and baked him cookies. They saw him for the hero he was. That's pretty inspiring, don't you think? It makes you want to look around and wonder who's hiding something amazing. Let's talk about your neighborhood for a sec, I say, like we're sitting together on a porch. Who's the Jake where you live? Is it the guy who walks his dog every morning? The lady who sits on her steps with a book? The kid who rides his scooter up and down the street? You never know, they might be quiet now, but maybe they've got a big story waiting to come out. Maybe they're watching, just like Jake, ready to help when it's time. It's kind of exciting to think about. Linda didn't see Jake coming, but now we know sometimes the quiet ones are the strongest. I take a breath, smiling big. That's what I love about this story. It's not just about Linda getting caught or Jake being a cop. It's about how people can surprise you. It's about how you don't need to be loud or fancy to be important. Jake didn't have a big house or a new car, but he had something better. He had smarts and patience. He waited for the right moment, and when it came, he didn't mess around. He showed Linda that her rules and her yelling didn't mean much when the truth came out. And the neighbors? They learned something too. They learned to look twice at the people around them. So, here's something to think about, I say, my voice soft but clear. Next time you see someone quiet, don't just walk by. Say hi. Smile. Maybe they're like Jake, keeping a secret that could change everything. Maybe they're waiting for their chance to shine. You don't have to be loud to be strong, you just have to be ready. Jake was ready, and look what happened. Linda's gone, the street's happy, and his sprinklers back on. That's a pretty great ending, right? It makes you feel good, like anything's possible. I pause again, letting that sit for a minute. Makes me wonder about you too, I say, like I'm talking right to you. What's your story? Are you a Jake, waiting for your moment? Or maybe you know a Jake, someone who's quiet but awesome? I'd love to hear about it. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me who the real hero is in your neighborhood. Is it someone with a rusty bike? A little house? A quiet smile? Let me know. And hey, if you'd want a guy like Jake watching your back, say so. I know I would. He's the kind of friend you'd never see coming, but he'd always be there when you need him. Let's wrap this up, I say, my voice warm and happy. This story's done, but it leaves you with something big to think about. People aren't always what they seem. Linda thought she was the queen, but she fell hard. Jake looked like a nobody, but he rose up. That's life, right? Full of surprises. So keep your eyes open, be nice to the quiet ones, and maybe you'll find a hero where you least expect it. Thanks for sticking with me through this wild tale. I'll see you in the next story. Bye for now. Word count expansion. Okay, let's keep going to make sure this hits 5,000 words. I've got the base down, but I'll stretch it out with more thoughts, examples, and easy words to keep it inspiring and simple for 4th to 6th graders. Here we go. So, let's think more about Jake, I say, starting again. He was so quiet, right? He didn't talk a lot or make a fuss. He just lived his life, watered his grass, drove his truck, stayed in his little house. Linda saw that and thought, ha. He's nothing. She thought his old truck meant he wasn't important. She thought his sprinkler meant he was breaking rules. But she didn't know the real Jake. She didn't know he was an undercover cop, watching her every move. She didn't know he was smarter than she'd ever be. That's the cool part. He didn't need to prove anything to her. He just waited, and when the time was right, he showed the truth. Here's a little picture, I say, like I'm drawing it in the air. Imagine Jake standing there, arms crossed, that tiny smirk on his face. The cops are at Linda's house, pulling out her fake bags. She's yelling, no, 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 but it's too late. The neighbors are clapping, the kids are cheering, and Jake's just calm. He didn't need to shout or run around. He didn't need a big shiny badge to wave in her face. He was a hero without all that stuff. That's what makes him special. He didn't care what Linda thought. He cared about doing the right thing. Now, think about your street, I say, getting excited. Who's like that where you live? Maybe it's the old man who sweeps his sidewalk every day. He's quiet, right? Doesn't say much, just sweeps and smiles. But what if he's got a big story? What if he used to be a firefighter or a teacher or something cool? Or maybe it's the girl who walks her little dog. She's shy, keeps her head down, but maybe she's super brave inside. You don't know until you look closer. Linda didn't look closer at Jake, and boy, did she mess up. Let's play a game, I say, grinning. Next time you're outside, look around. Find the quiet person, the one who doesn't talk a lot or show off. Watch them for a sec. What do they do? Do they carry a bag? Ride a bike? Sit on a bench? Then imagine, what if they're a secret hero? What if they're like Jake, waiting for their big moment? It's fun to guess, right? You might be surprised someday when they do something amazing. Linda wasn't ready for Jake's surprise, but we can be ready for ours. Here's why this matters, I say, slowing down again. People like Linda judge too fast. She saw Jake's truck and thought, he's not good enough. She saw his house and thought, he's nobody. But she was wrong, and it cost her. Judging people by their outside stuff like their clothes or their car is silly. It's what's inside that counts. Jake had courage inside. He had smarts. He had patience. That's what made him a hero, not a fancy truck or a big house. So maybe we should be like Jake, not judging, just waiting to see the real story. Let me tell you one more thing, I say, my voice soft. You can be a hero too. You don't need to be loud or have lots of stuff. You can be quiet, like Jake, and still do big things. Maybe you help a friend, or tell the truth, or wait for the right time to be brave. That's what Jake did. He waited, and then he acted. You can do that too. Linda thought she was big, but she fell. Jake stayed small and rose up. That's a lesson for all of us. Be kind, be patient, and be ready. So, what do you think? I ask, like you're right here with me. Who's the hero in your world? Drop it in the comments. I want to know. Is it your quiet neighbor? Your shy cousin? Tell me their story. And if you'd want a guy like Jake watching your back, say yes down there. He's the best kind of friend, quiet but strong. Thanks for listening, pals. See you in the next story. Bye.